4 United States presidents were assassinated: Abraham Lincoln, James A. Garfield, William McKinley, and John F. Kennedy. According to official stories, the latter 3 were killed by lone gunmen. Lincoln's death, however, was the result of a larger conspiracy. The assassin, John Wilkes Booth, had colluded with multiple individuals. The goal was to kill Union leaders, thus leaving the Union in disarray and reinvigorating the Confederate cause. The conspiracy wasn't orchestrated by the Confederate government. Rather, the conspirators were Northerners who sympathized with the Confederacy. Their targets were Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, Secretary of State William Seward, and General Ulysses S. Grant, but they only managed to kill Lincoln. Immediately after the shooting, John Wilkes Booth went on the run. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton directed an effort to catch Booth and to find any co-conspirators. Anyone who had even the slightest contact with Booth was a suspect. Hundreds of individuals were detained. However, all but 8 were let go. These individuals were Samuel Arnold, George Atzerodt, David Harold, Samuel Mudd, Michael O'Laughlin, Lewis Powell, Edmund Spangler, and Mary Surratt. There were 2 others involved who weren't arrested: John Wilkes Booth, of course, and John Surratt, the son of Mary. Even if the plan was successful, only 3 of the conspirators would have been directly involved in the killings. John Wilkes Booth was to kill Lincoln and Grant, George Atzerodt to kill Johnson, and Lewis Powell to kill Seward. Grant never came close to danger. He was supposed to be at the Ford's Theater with Lincoln on the night of the assassination. However, he'd turned down Lincoln's offer in favor of visiting his in-laws. George Atzerodt, the man tasked with killing Vice President Johnson, couldn't build up the nerve to carry out his part. He armed himself with a knife and went to the bar to drink and work himself up to the killing, but he ended up just wandering the streets. Powell actually made his way into Seward's home and would have killed him if it weren't for a splint on Seward's neck that protected him when Powell attempted to cut his throat. The other 7 had aided in the conspiracy indirectly. In the end, 4 of the 8 in custody were hanged. 3 were pardoned by President Johnson, and 1 died in prison. John Wilkes Booth was killed 12 days after Lincoln's death while resisting arrest. This is the official story. However, conspiracy theories emerged as soon as 1865 and are still circulating to this day. Number 1. Booth survived. This is perhaps the longest-going theory. Some variants of it state that Booth was allowed to escape, but most versions say that he got away. Supposedly, the government didn't want to appear incompetent, so they covered it up and have continued to do so. Allegedly, eyewitnesses claimed that the man who was shot in the barn wasn't Booth, but an unidentified red-haired man. Also, theorists note that this body wasn't turned over to Booth's family. Theorists maintain that the real Booth escaped, took the name John St. Helen, and then later Dave E. George before poisoning himself with arsenic in 1903. They also claim that all attempts to exhume Booth's corpse for DNA testing have been obstructed. It is true that the government initially didn't turn over the body. They wanted to prevent any kind of memorials by Southern sympathizers. In 1869, the Booth family was finally given the body. By this point, it had been positively identified by multiple doctors, including Booth's dentist, and by people who knew Booth. In 1994, 2 historians along with descendants of Booth wanted to have the body exhumed for testing. However, a judge declined, one of his main reasons being, quote, the unreliability of petitioners' less than convincing escape/cover-up theory. Nevertheless, theories about Booth's escape persist and likely will continue to. In fact, theories have been going around since as early as Booth's death. The man who killed him, Boston Corbett, was actually confronted with this theory. When a group of men accused Corbett of not actually having killed Booth, he was so enraged over being called a liar that he brandished a pistol and chased them out of the building. Number 2. Stanton's involvement. There are many theories that the conspiracy ran much deeper than just Booth and his group. The most popular theory claims that it was orchestrated by Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. After all, Stanton gained immense power following the assassination. He practically governed the South himself during much of Andrew Johnson's presidency. This theory became popular in 1937 when Austrian immigrant Otto Eisenschemmel published his book, Why Was Lincoln Murdered? Eisenschemmel claimed Stanton ordered Grant away on the night of the assassination, purposefully hired a defective bodyguard for Lincoln, allowed one bridge to be kept open so Booth could escape, and had destroyed incriminating pages from Booth's diary. In the official story, Stanton requested that Booth be taken alive, but Sergeant Boston Corbett acted against Stanton's orders and killed Booth anyway. However, Eisenschemmel claims that Booth's death was planned all along, so he couldn't be interrogated. Eisenschemmel's evidence is mostly circumstantial, outright fabrications, or based on faulty sources and misinformation that was going around during the time of the assassination. He's been widely discredited by historians. Number 3. Radical Republicans. Variants of the Stanton theory claim he conspired with radical Republicans or with Vice President Andrew Johnson. The supposed motive of the radical Republicans was to maintain their faction's power. If the Southern states were to be fully reintegrated as Lincoln planned, radicals would naturally lose political power, though even under Johnson, the South eventually rejoined the Union anyways. In less than 5 years, all of the Confederate states were back in the Union, regardless of Lincoln's death. Number 4. Andrew Johnson. Theories about Andrew Johnson's involvement point to his handling of Reconstruction. Initially, Johnson seemed to be following in Lincoln's footsteps, but within only a month, he became more lenient with the Southern elite and had taken away provisions for freed slaves. In regards to Johnson and Stanton working together, this seems extremely unlikely when considering just how often the two would clash over the next 4 years, with Johnson even removing Stanton from his position, something which Johnson did at the risk of impeachment. One piece of evidence for Johnson's involvement was a note left by John Wilkes Booth. At 3 p.m., the day of the assassination, Booth stopped by Johnson's residence. Johnson wasn't home. He was actually at the White House. Booth left a note with Johnson's secretary. It read, "I don't wish to disturb you. Are you at home? J. Wilkes Booth." Historians still don't know why he left the note, though it's not believed that the two were conspiring. It's suspected, rather, that Booth was either trying to see if Johnson would be coming home at some point, or that he was worried that Atzerodt wouldn't kill him and thus wanted to frame him. Theorists also point to a comment by Lincoln's widow, Mary. While leaving the White House, she made a comment about Johnson having known about the assassination. However, Mary was well known for irrational remarks and poor relations with many in Washington, and these traits were only exacerbated after her husband's death. So it's likely her remark was based on nothing but emotion. Number 5. George Atzerodt's confession. George Atzerodt, the man tasked with killing Andrew Johnson, repeatedly maintained that he had no involvement in the planned murders. Through multiple confessions, Atzerodt claimed that he was involved in the original plan, which was to capture the president, but disapproved once the objective changed to murder. He said that Booth ordered him to kill Johnson, even threatening to, quote, blow his brains out if he didn't do so, but even then he refused. He claimed his fellow conspirators continued to pressure him, and even placed a large knife and pistol in his room. Atzerodt said he never intended to kill the vice president, and didn't think the others would actually go through with killing Lincoln. The accepted narrative is that Atzerodt was fully willing to kill Johnson and okay with the other killings, but that he simply couldn't work himself up to actually doing it. The prosecution argued this, pointing to the fact that earlier on April 14th, Atzerodt booked a room in the hotel where Johnson was staying and asked the bartender about Johnson's whereabouts. It was at the hotel bar that he became intoxicated and simply began wandering the streets. A woman also noticed Atzerodt throw a knife into a gutter, likely the weapon he was planning to use in the murder. It's believed that Atzerodt merely made up the story of his reluctance to try to throw his co-conspirators under the bus. Those who believe his story point to the consistency in his multiple confessions, saying it's more likely that by the time the plan had switched from capture to assassination, he was simply in too deep and the others wouldn't let him leave. Number 6. Lincoln versus the banks. There are various theories that Lincoln was killed because of larger financial interest. There are many variants of these theories, and extensive discussion of each one is beyond the scope of this video. One theory claims that Lincoln was killed as a result of his opposition to the Federal Reserve. A popular meme circulating on the internet in 2013 showed both Lincoln and John F. Kennedy with the caption, "These are the only two presidents who ever attempted to end the Federal Reserve banking system. What else do they have in common?" In reality, there was no Federal Reserve prior to 1913. There had been a national bank. Andrew Jackson strongly opposed the Second National Bank of the United States, leading to its dissolution. Some claim that the 1835 assassination attempt on him was set up by the banking interest, who then, 30 years later, successfully assassinated Abraham Lincoln. This is unlikely, as Jackson and Lincoln were actually on opposite sides of the banking issue. They would never battle in the political arena directly, as by the time Lincoln had been elected to the House of Representatives in 1847, Jackson had already died 2 years prior. However, Jackson's fiercest opponent during his presidency was Henry Clay, who was a massive influence on Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln once described himself as, quote, "an old-line Whig, a disciple of Henry Clay." Unlike Jackson, Henry Clay supported the rechartering of the Second National Bank. In his first ever political speech, Lincoln even said, "I am in favor of the National Bank. I am in favor of the internal improvement system and of a high protective tariff. These are my sentiments and political principles." Some still argue that Lincoln changed his position shortly before his death, and this betrayal is what got him killed. They cite this quote as evidence. "I see in the future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. As a result of the war, corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until all the wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed." Lincoln never actually said this. It was even discredited mockingly by Lincoln's son Robert back in the 1800s. Nevertheless, it's still attributed to Lincoln to this day, even in 2007 by former Vice President Al Gore. Though Gore had no conspiratorial intentions by using it, his usage of the quote does go to show just how prevalent misinformation used in conspiracy theories can be even long after the misinformation is debunked. Number 7. Jefferson Davis's involvement. As early as the assassination, there was a theory that Southern leaders were responsible. Just days prior, Davis had fled the Confederate capital. President Andrew Johnson put out a $100,000 reward for the capture of Davis, declaring that he had, quote, "incited, concerted, and procured Lincoln's murder." Upon learning of Lincoln's death, Davis reportedly said, "If it were to be done at all, it were better that it were done well. And if the same had been done to Andy Johnson the Beast and to Secretary Stanton, the job would then be complete." Davis was finally captured on May 10, 1865. Ultimately, no connection between him and the assassins was ever found. He was instead charged with treason, though he'd eventually be given amnesty. Nevertheless, conspiracy theories persist. Many are related to the Confederate Secret Service, which was run by Davis's Secretary of State, Judah Benjamin. During the final desperate months of the war, Benjamin's agents concocted plots to attack the North beyond the battlefield. These included spreading yellow fever through Philadelphia, burning New York City, and even blowing up the White House, or at least enough of it to take out Lincoln and his cabinet. It's rumored that they also planned to capture Lincoln, which does mirror the original intent of Booth and his conspirators. Following the war, Benjamin fled to Europe. Like with Davis, it was concluded that he had no involvement in the Lincoln assassination. Benjamin destroyed nearly all of his personal papers, leaving many to believe they contained clues to his involvement. If the Confederate leaders such as Davis and Benjamin were involved, it's believed that either the United States government simply never had enough evidence to confirm it, or that they intentionally covered it up as it would hinder reconciliation with the South. Number 8. The Catholic Church. In his 1886 book, 50 Years in the Church of Rome, Charles Chiniquy declared that it was the Roman Catholic Church who had Lincoln killed. Chiniquy was a Catholic priest who defected from the church, converted to Protestantism, and became a political activist, touring around the country giving lectures on the evil and corruption of the Catholic Church. In 1855, Chiniquy ran into legal trouble with the church and was defended by then-lawyer Abraham Lincoln. It was the highest-profile case in Lincoln's career. This much isn't doubted. However, Chiniquy states in his book that Lincoln's defiance to the will of the church made him a marked man. Chiniquy claims that he warned Lincoln of this, but to no avail. He said he later reunited with Lincoln during his presidency and repeatedly warned him about a Jesuit plot. It was also the church, according to Chiniquy, that not only influenced Booth and the other conspirators, but had also worked with Jefferson Davis to try to win the Civil War for the Confederacy. Some of this is supported by actual events, such as the fact that the Pope was the only world leader to formally recognize the Confederate States as a nation. However, ultimately, all Chiniquy's book contains is circumstantial evidence. Beyond Chiniquy's claims, there's a larger conspiracy theory that proposes that the Catholic Church was not only behind the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, but also the deaths of William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor, and the formation of the Confederacy. This theory will be discussed in its own dedicated video coming out next week. Until then, you can watch the first 2 parts of this series if you haven't already. You can also subscribe for future installments, along with other videos on United States presidents. You can support the channel by donating on Patreon. Donations from $2 to $15 a month help towards more frequent uploads. Patreon link in the description below.